I call to order the August 18th, 2015 meeting of the Arvada Planning Commission. Ms. Brown, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Brandy Caswell, David Goff,
Present.
Steve Hannon,
Here.
John Sullivan,
Here.
John Kraus, Patricia Connell,
Here.
Ed Rothschild.
Here.
I move to excuse Commissioners Kraus and Caswell from the meeting. Commissioners, cast your votes. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. I have to lock her out first. Okay, now cast your votes. You'll have to vote again, Steve, I'm sorry. And that passes 5-0 with Commissioners Sullivan, Rothschild, Connell, Goff, and Hannon all voting in favor. The minutes of the August 4th meeting have been submitted for approval. Are there any additions or corrections to the meeting minutes? No. Seeing none, the minutes stand approved as corrected. We'll move on to general business. There are no general business items to discuss this evening. Moving on to reports, there are also no reports. And so now would you please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, we'll move on to petitions and communications. This is a time when anyone may address the Commission regarding items that are not listed as public hearings on tonight's agenda. The hearings on tonight's agenda are the Land Development Code amendments, use table definitions. Additionally, we would ask that you would hold comments regarding any application that has been filed with the city or which is likely to be filed with the city until the public hearing on those items, where we will welcome your comments. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the Commission regarding anything else? No? All right, seeing nothing, we'll move on to public hearings. At this time, I'd like to explain the procedure for public hearings. The applicant will be given an opportunity to make a presentation. After the presentation, I'll ask those who are in favor of the applicant to speak, and then those who are in opposition. The applicant will then be given an opportunity for rebuttal. After all the testimony has been heard, the public input portion of the hearing will be closed and questions will be taken from the Planning Commission. I would now like to swear in anyone who wishes to speak in any public hearing matter before this Commission tonight. Please rise, raise your right hand, and I'll swear you all in now. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in matters before this Commission is the truth and nothing but the truth? If so, please answer, I do. I do. Thank you. You may be seated. All right, the first and only public hearing tonight is Land Development Code Amendments, LDC 2015-0001, Land Development Code Amendments, Use Table Definitions. Staff, are there any posting or notification requirements?
All public notice, public notice requirements have been met as published in the local paper.
All right. The staff report, posting log, and affidavit of mailing then, or I don't know if we have all those pieces.
Mailing,
yeah, we don't.
No mailing, just
legislative,
public posting.
Okay,
the
just
paper.
the public
Yes.
posting then is made a permanent part of the record.
Right.
Are there any additions or corrections to the staff report?
No.
Is there a representative? I think that would be us. Right? Somebody
y-
from the city staff?
Yes,
Giving
Mr. Todd Messenger with Fairfield and Woods and our consultant for the Land Development Code rewrite will be making the presentation. This presentation will include a brief overview of the process to date, a description of the proposed amendments before you this evening, and a description of the next steps for additional code rewrite in the next several months and the next couple of years. With that being said, Mr. Messenger will now make a presentation.
Should I go to the...
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. Again, I'm Todd Messenger, Fairfield and Woods, 1801 California Street, Denver. And tonight we're going to be presenting the status of the Land Development Code Uses Update and Analysis Project. talk about the interim ordinance that's now in process that you'll be considering this evening, and then talk about a few steps moving forward from here. So turning to the PowerPoint. So we wouldn't normally think of Abraham Lincoln as a planner, but he did say some things that planners really love, and one of the things he said is the best way to predict your future is to create it. And so what that means in the city of Arvada with respect to land development code is that it should be about plan implementation. And so on the one hand, we have our vision that's expressed in the Arvada Comprehensive Plan. And of course, that's up there for simplicity because we also have a number of urban renewal authority plans, we have transportation plans, and lots of other plans as well. But they all fit under that comprehensive planning heading. And then we have what we hope is the market for products that we're planning for. And what we really need to do in a land development code is bridge that gap. And so the gratuitous animation for the evening. We need to draw that link in between, and basically what that means is we need to bring vision and market together in one place. And that place, in terms of the legislative capacity of the city, is that land development code. And there it is, the gratuitous animation for the evening, and also probably the most important principle in planning that we can provide to you this evening. So the scope of our work, the city of course already knew all of this and watched the breakdown of its code from its comprehensive plan and the departure of the two, and rewrote its comprehensive plan and adopted that while we were underway with our initial analysis. And so we were hired to do a three-part analysis and provide some recommendations. The first is the near-term issues, which were that the use table was causing some headaches in terms of administration, in terms of marketing the city in an economic development capacity, in terms of just getting things done in the planning department. And then there were some other areas of concern that have since kind of dropped out, the definition of family and how to deal with reasonable accommodations and so forth. And then there were some midterm issues. And the midterm issue really when we started this was, are the variance practices and procedures in Arvada appropriate? Is there a better way that we could be handling variances from the code, at least in the interim between today's code and tomorrow's code? And what we found out was that there was really no desire to change that process at this point, that the variance procedures are being used principally right now for signage and for a couple of other minor points. And the Board of Adjustment didn't feel really a need after we explained to them how they ought to use what they have in terms of what the order of operations will be, mathematically speaking. They said, okay, we're good with that. And so we didn't end up having to do much there. But what came out in the meantime was this decision from the U.S. Supreme Court called Reed v. Gilbert. And that put our sign code recommendations really on the front burner. Reed v. Gilbert basically said, if the contents of your sign code address the content of the sign, then it is presumptively unconstitutional. And the hurdle you have to jump over to overcome that presumption is incredibly high. And really when they say it's presumptively unconstitutional, you can basically presume it will not survive. So we are now working with the city staff to make a proposal to correct the issues. And then the long-term issues, there's some strategic recommendations for long-term reform, how to deal with the various development contexts in the city of Arvada, for example, from new development in what we would call green fields or farm fields to redevelopment and infill development, all of which require different types of regulations to address them appropriately. So we took those things in mind and we took a tremendous amount of input. We had your land development code, which is a good place to start. We took the comprehensive plan, the transit and transportation plans, the urban renewal authority plans, strategic plans, and so forth. And we got a bunch of community involvement. We had a number of focus groups that were well attended. We had a use table advisory committee to help us refine our work. We went to the Planning Commission. We went to the City Council. We had open houses. And we had some information from business interests that was passed through the economic development folks here in Arvada. We met with the city staff, we relied on our own experience, and we read the Reed v. Gilbert decision, we wrote about the Reed v. Gilbert decision, and we spoke about it, and we got to understand it very, very well. So we had a tremendous amount of stuff to digest, to come up with some recommended near-term actions, and these recommendations we feel are a synthesis not only of the original recommendations we had towards the beginning of this project now, but also of all the community input that we were able to obtain along the way, and which really helped us, I think, to set priorities that are much more appropriate for this community than just sort of our academic look at things. So we're really excited about the level of participation we had in this process. So from there, we move to the use table, and that's really the core of the ordinance that we've proposed that you'll be considering for recommendation to council. And the use table right now, as we see it, may be discouraging investment. And the reason for that is the mesh of the use table, that is the number of zoning districts across the top as against the number of uses that are listed down the side, is too fine a grain. And because of that, if you have uses that would normally associate together, you might have a couple of zoning districts where you ought to be able to do that, and you can't because one or more of the uses aren't allowed while others are. So there isn't a real good logic to it anymore, and part of that is because zoning codes evolve over time, and we don't always look back and see, well, how does this fit into what we've done before? We look prospectively, what do we want to do now and tomorrow? And I think when you go to rewrite a zoning code, you need to look at it in terms of how are we going to fit all this together to advance everything all at once. In the meantime, we can fix some of that mesh, and we'll reserve the rest for the code rewrite process. And really establishing those priorities is what UTAC played a serious role in, and also in those public input workshops that we had. And then, making matters worse, on the left side of the use table where all the uses are listed, many of those uses are either not defined or ill-defined or have overlapping definitions with other uses that require then interpretation, which can lead to frustration and even combat and litigation. And then we have emerging uses or combinations of uses that aren't very well addressed at this point. We've got a whole bunch of new senior living products that we could probably fit in under some of the uses you've already got there, but it would be helpful, I think, to that industry to just say so. We've got telecommunications hotels, which have been out there for a long time, but there's some market for potentially here. We just want to get some of these things into the code and make sure that people know that are building these products, welcome to Arvada, here's where those things are appropriate. So we believe that short-term reforms to avoid this micromanagement, or to begin to avoid that micromanagement, to reduce confusion and to better reflect and anticipate market conditions, and then in doing all of that, to just define all the uses so that everybody knows what they mean, everybody shares a consistent vocabulary, is important and worth doing. A lot of times, it's better to just reform the whole code all at once, but on the short run, we're in the middle of a pretty good economy now, and we want to bring primary employers to Arvada, and we need to focus in on some of the things that we believe may be holding them back. So the short-term fixes that we're talking about, they're not long-term cures. We still have some inconsistencies in the code that you'll have to deal with in implementing this, but at least you'll invite people in the door and you'll be able to work with them in a way that you really can't do as effectively today. And here's the best example, I think, is the industrial uses. So in the existing code, you have a number of industrial uses that are specified with sometimes incredible levels of specificity, like soil amendments, packaging, and processing. In the new proposed code, you've got light industry, heavy logistics center, and heavy industry. And everything that you've currently got in your existing code will fit into one of those categories, and so will everything else that people want to do in the primary employment context. And feel free to stop me at any time if you have a question. I just want to make sure that that's well understood. And here's how we split that up. So on the left side of this graph, we have heavy truck traffic, and going across the bottom, we have external impacts like noise, dust, odor, higher risk of explosion, outdoor storage, outdoor processing equipment, things that people consider either risky or ugly. And so as we drive up the truck traffic, but we don't have those other things, we have what we call heavy logistics center, which would be, if you go out I-70, you can see Safeway and King Soopers have these facilities that, and not in Arvada, but that have just bay doors everywhere, and they do the trucking from those facilities. That would be a heavy logistics center, and there may be some demand for that in Arvada at some point. And then we have light industrial, which is, may have some heavy truck traffic. It may have up to a certain amount of truck traffic in terms of distribution to the local marketplace. It may be wholesale bakeries. It may be any number of other light industrial, low external impacts kind of uses. And it really invites people to come in and exercise their creativity. How can you bring primary employment here? Chances are it's going to be light industry. Almost everything that people want to do that's not retail is going to be in that light industry category in terms of making stuff, fixing stuff, and whatever. There are some exceptions to that, of course, like in regards to automobiles and body shops and that kind of stuff. And then there's heavy industry, which is, you think about it in terms of concrete processing plants and refineries and all of that, but there's just a whole load of stuff that's either heavy truck traffic or heavy external impacts or both, and that would all go into heavy industry. Think about federal air permit requirements, you're thinking about heavy industry. So that's kind of how we split those things off. Any questions about how we did that? More importantly, any questions about why we would do such a thing? Again, makes it a lot simpler for the applicant to come in and presume to be light industrial right away and then know in the chart where they go, not having to compare themselves to something else. The other thing that got a whole lot of press was the dealing with places of assembly and taking away the religious language from the code that you have in today. So there's a federal law called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act that's been in effect for about 15 years. And it was unanimously adopted by Congress, and Congress never does anything unanimously, so it's a marked occasion when they do. And it says that no government shall impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that treats a religious assembly or institution on less than equal terms with a non-religious assembly or institution. We think that blade cuts both directions, and that if you're going to allow a church, then you also need to allow, the Elks Lodge in that same space. Now, the good news is places of assembly that are high impact in nature have certain needs in terms of their location. So we won't be seeing mega churches taking over neighborhoods because they need more land for parking, for facility, and so forth, and they're going to get on half acre or an acre within a neighborhood. But where you have the neighborhood church, if that turned into something like an Elks Lodge or whatever, we also think it probably would have reasonably comparable impacts. Now, a lot of times we see peak traffic at churches on Sundays and Wednesdays, and these would have maybe different peak traffic, but this is what the federal law tells us we have to do. Now, in Colorado, schools are the comparators, if you will, to churches, so they have to be allowed in the same sorts of places. And a clubhouse amenity to a residential development that's private, like the apartment complex with a clubhouse, is not like a church. But in the United States, generally, courts have held private clubs, daycare, civic clubs, auditorium, assembly hall, community center, senior center, fraternal organizations, and political clubs all could be comparators. There's a fairly convincing U.S. Attorney General Office memorandum on that point, which we've shared with you previously. And so those are all things to look out for. Not law in 10th Circuit yet, could be law in 10th Circuit at any time. Any questions about RLUIPA and why we did that? So our direction was just allow the secular institution where the churches are allowed, which basically means that those sorts of assembly halls would be allowed everywhere. Economic development was another big key. We want to enhance opportunity for primary employment. We alluded to this in the industrial classifications. Redefining industrial use does allow a greater range of uses. We also refine the land uses in the PUDI district and in many other districts, but PUDI I think is a really good example where people were frustrated that they had light industrial users that couldn't get in to PUDI as easily as they should. There's too much process, too much delay would create a situation where somebody would just assume go somewhere else. So another thing that people were concerned about was outdoor storage. The amount of outdoor storage for industrial uses was fairly limited in PUDI. We wanted to make sure that we had opened up the opportunities for outdoor storage so that modern uses that really involve that primary work could come in and take advantage of that. Regionally, outdoor storage is very much frowned upon, and that city that can balance the aesthetic interests and the cost interests as against the outdoor storage properly will get more primary employers this way. Reduce dependence on conditional use approvals and provide targeted expansion of as-of-right uses, and we'll show you how we did that. This is just an example of the sorts of changes that we made to the use table. Down the side is some uses that were changed in the PUD districts, PUDR, which is residential, PUDBP, which is business park, PUDBPR, which has a residential component to it and business park, and PUDI, which is industrial. And my eyes aren't real good to read that from here, but you can see everything that turned into an A became allowed from either a C, which was conditional, or an X was it wasn't previously allowed. And you see big changes in PUDI, in particular with respect to light industry. And we have an asterisk there because you didn't really have light industry before. You just had a list of uses, some of which would be light industrial. So it's a big change in PUDI to allow light industry generally in a district that presumably was there to allow light industry in the first place because it's named PUDI. But you can see a whole bunch of other things came in as well. And we put an asterisk there by vehicle sales and rentals, just so you know, that's indoors only. We don't anticipate inviting car lots with outdoor storage of inventory into the PUDI district. So that's just, it's not a big change there, but it does make those sorts of facilities allowed, as they are in some of the other industrial areas in the city. So you get the sense of the level of change. And in PUD districts anyway, the land use approval exercise usually involves specific users. So to impose a conditional use on top of that adds process where we don't think process is necessary. Some other adaptations, we added definitions and addressed new uses like data centers and charging stations for electric vehicles. I understand Tesla's rolling out some stations regionally. You can now invite them here and say we have a classification that allows that. We expanded live, work, and urban passive recreation opportunities. As a cleanup item, really. The passive recreation being parks and plazas wasn't necessarily allowed in all the zoning districts where you'd expect to see that. Not like anybody would frown on it or turn it away, but we wanted to reconcile the code with the reality. Addressing a wider range of senior living products, we talked about that a little at the beginning. We deleted some obsolete uses like reservoir construction, which we weren't really sure what that was in the first instance, but now it's gone. And we changed produce stand to an accessory use, which isn't a huge change, but it's an easy change, and it doesn't ripple through the code and create collateral damage. So to implement all of these recommended short-term changes, we proposed an interim ordinance, and that's in process just before you this evening. It provides a 2 to 3 year fix to improve Article 5 and Article 10. Article 10 is where all the definitions are. So all the cross-referencing out of the use table in Article 5 goes to Article 10. And we think it provides a decent foundation for further long-term reforms. In other words, we don't like to have to reinvent the wheel twice. We want to make the changes, we want to see how it works, and as we're reforming the entire code, we want to preserve as much of the work that has already been done as possible. There's a lot of volunteer hours that have gone into this. We've reached consensus on many of these use table items, so we would build a new code from that central core of consensus and agreement that we've already found. So the schedule hearing dates on this, we met with the City Council on August 17th. I'm sorry, we didn't, but they had first reading. And then tonight is the Planning Commission meeting, and then City Council again on September 21st. So any questions about the short term? Because we're about to turn to the midterm. Good? Okay. So the up next, if you will, is the recommended midterm actions. And the big one is the sign code. The Reed v. Gilbert case changed the legal landscape for the regulation of signs. I think I may have talked about this case pending the last time we talked. So you're all familiar with the fact pattern. It's a pastor of a church wanted the directional signs to be treated the same way as political signs. They look the same if you don't read them. And he said, this is really based on my speech and not on my sign. And that shouldn't be allowed. And the court unanimously agreed with that premise, with all justices concurring. Not every one of them joined the majority, but they did have a majority opinion. So in light of Reed v. Gilbert, we think that the sign code should be comprehensively addressed and rewritten. And in doing that, provide an opportunity for a lot of public input, as we did in this first phase, to make sure not only are we addressing the problems as the court would see them in Reed v. Gilbert, but also whatever the economic development and community character issues are, so that we can balance the interests of businesses, of nonprofit organizations and residents and homeowners to have their free speech as against the community character and sign clutter and property values and public safety and all of those other issues. And every community has its own unique balance and own unique issues with signs. So we want to identify all that and reconcile all that, make sense of it, and provide a sign code in the midterm. And the only reason we would do that before a code rewrite is because the Supreme Court sort of said, this is what you need to be doing now. So just going back one, just to make sure, also streamlining and simplifying administration and enforcement. The existing sign code is a little bit confusing, I think, with respect to the number of categories of signs and the fact that they may overlap with each other. And I think in the biggest problem I would have with it, even without Reed, is that many specific uses in your sign code, or specific speakers, if you will, are allowed, X sign, while another speaker in the same zoning district may be allowed Y. And they could both theoretically use the same building, but as you switch the tenant in the building, you've got to change the sign to be compliant. We think the signs should be based on the zoning district and the frontage and whatever physical parameters mean that you don't have to continuously change your sign to become in compliance. And we also believe that an update to the sign code could reduce the demand for variances in Arvada to near zero. Moving on to variance, again, we provided a flow chart to navigate the variance standards, which are kind of difficult to navigate just on their face. It took me a number of reads just to figure out how to do the flow chart. We think it was pretty helpful, and so we basically anticipate that once the sign code and the land development code more generally are rewritten, the Board of Adjustment won't have very much to do anymore, because most of the flexibility will either be built in or addressed in a different way. So variances as the language of flexibility in the code will go back to real hardships and real unique situations. And we hope that through the process that we intend to run, we wouldn't see that very much, because we have anticipated a lot of the problems that come up, because we tend to hear about those. Any questions about the midterm? Sign codes are fun to rewrite. They're complicated, they're emotional. There's a lot, people understand signs in a content-based way, so there's a lot of education that comes along with it to start to understand it in a different way. So the Land Development Code rewrite process, basically we need to simplify the structure, the standards, and the procedures in the current Land Development Code. In my view, and I hope it's shared, we've talked about this a long time ago, if process isn't adding value for the community or the project, then we shouldn't have the process. And secondly, philosophically, and I've mentioned this joke before, but you know, most people are afraid of public speaking, and in fact, the statistics show that more people are afraid of public speaking than dying. So that at any given funeral, more people would rather be in the casket than delivering the eulogy. And yet, we ask people to go up in front of boards and commissions all the time to basically do a thesis defense for their business that you want in the city anyway. Probably most of those folks would rather just either submit an application or ask for forgiveness than go in front of a public hearing. And so while I may enjoy doing this kind of work, most people don't, and we want to streamline the process for them. Invite mom and pop back in, you know, come into Arvada, open your business. We'll try to make it easy for you to do. We also think philosophically we should be using the market to deliver community benefits that are both economically feasible and physically compatible with their surroundings. And because those things are different from community to community, that's another reason why we need a very strong public participation element, so people can tell us what they want to do, why they can't do it, how we can get them from here to there. We want to provide different approaches for different contexts like development, redevelopment, infill development, and expansion of existing buildings. And we want to focus on community character. And going back to sort of square one of the discussion, community character is that balance between buildings, landscaping, and pavement. And when we focus on community character, it's much easier to get to the design issues. But really, how much landscaping is in the environment, how much architecture is in the environment, that matters to people on a fundamental level before we worry about paint colors and materials and fenestration and all the things that we worry about as designers. So the LDC rewrite process, we would use our strategic assessment report as a guiding document, but it does not provide sufficient detail to just write the code. We want to use the community to help us identify the priorities, help us identify the real challenges, and work through issues in great specificity so that we can take our recommended tools and actually calibrate them for the city of Arvada and test them and truth test them and test them again to make sure that they will work here to deliver the sorts of products that you want. We anticipate then a representative advisory committee focusing in on the issues, acting as a sounding board for policy direction, suggested tools, and macro level calibration of those tools. We expect to use open houses and online review and comment should the city opt to use the sorts of tools that provide for that, and we can point you in the right direction for that as well. And regular engagement, of course, of the City Council, of this body, and of the Board of Adjustment to make sure that those who will be implementing on the public hearing level and those who will be processing the ordinances understand what's in them and get all their questions answered and all their issues addressed along the way. So any questions about implementation? And that's all we have for this evening. We thank you for your time.
I will now open the hearing to comments from the public. Is there anybody who would like to speak in favor?
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I'm one of those people that would rather give the eulogy than be in the coffin. So, I was a participant in the Use Table Advisory Committee.
I'm sorry, Ms. Young, do you mind?
Oh, I'm
just giving us
sorry.
the spelling and address?
I forgot. My name
So
is
it's on the tape
Nancy.
in the right place.
I know. My name is Nancy Young. I live at 7706 Robinson Way, right here in Arvada. I was a participant in the Use Table Advisory Committee. The sessions were basically quite general and focused more on how to define various uses and to combine them. And I thought there was a lot of very good feedback. Overall, I support the proposal that is before you this evening. However, as you all know, I'm never satisfied. There was one very small item that caught my attention. It happens to be on page 10-19 of the attachments. It is regarding motor vehicle repairs and service light. And I just happened to notice about the middle of that paragraph, it says, but in no case will repair shops where vehicles are stored in an inoperable condition for more than 24 hours be allowed? And then I got to thinking about it. How many times have I taken my car to my local repair shop? They didn't have the part. They had to send to Kansas to get it. And I didn't have my car for a couple of days, and it was inoperable. I realized this is actually a rather minor consideration, but again, the Use Table Advisory Committee was not involved in the specific definitions, at which point that might have been caught. So I would like to just reiterate that the Use Table Advisory Committee was, I think, an excellent route, and I'm looking forward to participating in future aspects of this entire project. Thank you.
Is there anybody else from the public who would like to speak? Maybe in lieu of I don't want to call it a rebuttal necessarily, but maybe you could use a rebuttal time. I noticed that that's actually stricken language. Do you know if the new language, sorry, it's just stricken? Oh, it's not stricken? Oh, this is new. Oh. Well, that changes a lot. That changes everything.
Yeah, it's red, Mr. Chairman, but it's underlined, so that's
Gotcha.
actually new or reorganized, possibly, language. It's a fairly typical standard to have 24 hours being the definition for light versus sort of more body shops and heavy engine repair and that. Obviously, in terms of enforcement, if a car has to stick around for a couple days or whatever, most of the time the code enforcement officer is not going to know. But if there's a real issue in terms of this definition, of course we can change it. You know, that's really the reason that we have a public process in this instance.
All right, well, I will close the public input portion and open it to questions from the commission. Mr. Rothschild.
So I'm going to show my ignorance a little bit on the A, B, and C's in the chart. So the reorganization on the left, the land use, makes perfect sense to me. Looks great.
Okay.
So where I need to understand better, and I'm sure it's just because I don't understand the zoning well enough, is the discrepancies between, for example, I-1 and I-2, where something may not be allowed but is under PUD. So we could pull an example. For example, farmers markets is allowed under PUDI but not allowed under I-1 and I-2.
Okay.
Can you explain that to me?
Well, the Use Table Advisory Committee asked us about that, and some of the owners of PUDI land said, well, you know, why wouldn't we be able to do a farmer's market in a parking lot on a weekend, for example, or have a farmer's market in an industrial park as part of the overall planned unit development design. And so in PUDI, it was a little bit easier because you have that planned unit development process that comes along with it to sort of organize the development around something like that. But there's really no reason in policy why you wouldn't also have it in I-1, which would be sort of more light industrial. I-2, next to a cement plant or something, may be less compatible, but probably also not a big deal. The market would drive those farmers markets to where they needed to go. And so I'm certainly not, from a policy level, opposed to adding farmers market to those districts if that's the will of the city.
Because there's a lot of them in here that have that discrepancy, and
Sure.
it would require going piece by piece, fast food is allowed under PUDI, but not under I-1 or I-2.
Right.
And I don't understand philosophically why that would be the case. And there's a bunch, you could go line by line and see those discrepancies.
Right. I think at the end of the day, what we tried to do was identify the reform priorities, and as part of an overall land development code overhaul, we would actually dispense with a number of these zoning districts and restructure it so that we could have fewer districts across the top, thus making a more sensible mesh. And so we thought, rather than make big changes to the table, we'll make the changes that have economic development implications on the short run and not really worry about the discrepancies in terms of sort of more policy-oriented issues. If you look at the overall inventories of land and available land, the PUDI made more impact, and that's why we focus more on it.
My opinion, it's internally inconsistent. I'd rather see the A there than not have it. That's my personal opinion.
We can certainly make that change, and upon direction of this body, we would be more than happy to do that right away.
pass it on.
Ms. Connell?
Yes, thank you. I just have what would be an example of a live-work unit? I mean, a description, certainly the people are living in there, but then it's also a work unit, so just a brief example.
So a lot of times they have like an artist or studio space downstairs available for public access to the street, and then either in the back of the house or on top of it, either a lofted or door access, interior door access residential living space. There are some examples regionally of that kind of product. It takes a variety of different forms. I think in North Boulder, there's an example near Holiday on the west side of Broadway, where they've clustered some live-work units around a parking court where people live above and work below, and they have offices or light industrial or artisan studios, things like that.
Thank you. Just wanted a qualification.
Sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Hannan?
Exhibit D, kind of echoing what Commissioner Hochschild said. We have I-1, I-2, and we added PUD I, but in other places we seem to keep it separate from the other industrial uses, and that was just kind of confusing to me, just as a comment.
I guess I'm not entirely clear on how we...
Well, often in the actual table, we have things allowed in I, but not in PUD I, Planned Urban Development I.
Correct.
In this exhibit, we added PUD I, but in the table, I was having problems seeing that consistency. Again, as Commissioner Rothschild said, to me, industrial is industrial, and so we probably ought to have some amount of consistency there,
Sure.
as we do here with height.
We would be more than happy to add any number of A's to the I column at the discretion of this body that we can take forward as a recommendation to council. And again, the reason that we focused on PUDI is because the members of our UTAC were focused on it as an economic development problem, and that the I-1 and I-2 districts weren't a big economic development problem at this point. So your economic development folks here at the city also, they're trying to bring people into that PUDI district, and they just needed a short-term fix.
Got it.
But we're more than happy to make it consistent. I like consistency, and we guarantee on the long term, if we do a code rewrite, we'll shoot towards that goal as sharply as we can.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mr. Goff?
Thank you. Hopefully this isn't too dumb of a question, but on the table it references vehicle sales and rentals indoors from X to A. Is it? I was just trying to understand. Do we only allow vehicles sales and rentals to be indoors?
Only in that area with the footnote.
Okay.
So right now you have a classification separate for that, and we collapsed it. And so we wanted to make sure not to take away the use where it was already allowed. So instead of allowing a broader use in that zoning district, we just footnoted it and said, in this district, it's contingent upon only being a smaller subset of the allowable use.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
How's that different from a conditional use? Why wouldn't it be a C instead of an A with an asterisk?
Because if it's indoors, it's allowed. There's no further process.
Okay.
Rather than having a conditional use where you say, well, it has to be indoors. We can just say that and have it staff approved.
Mr. Rothschild?
We may have discussed this at a prior meeting, and I don't remember the answer, but very specific use, and that's any kind of marijuana-related facilities are specifically left out, it appears. And while we have a moratorium, that doesn't preclude something changing in the future. So am I missing where it's in here?
It's
or
not a moratorium. We moved from that moratorium, City
To a
Council
permanent.
moved eventually to ordinance prohibiting.
So it will never be an issue, and we don't need it under definitions.
Well, there's a city code provision that's, it's a full chapter, if I recall, that prohibits marijuana activities in various manifestations, the retail stores, the grow operations, and so on and so forth, yeah. If that were to ever change, then we would want to amend the land development code to reflect that.
Yeah, I guess my question was more on, not even in the table, but as a definition, whether it needs to be here. And be excluded, but if it's covered elsewhere, that's fine. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman?
Well, there's no other comments, no other lights up here, so I think there's no more questions. I have a quick question. Maybe it's more of a comment, and I think you probably agree with me, and I think this is probably in the long-term vision part. But I love the idea of collapsing the district, not the districts, the zoning, in making them more impact designated. I'd like to see that outside of the commercial. And so as we go through and do more of this, I'm hoping that we can see more of that happening. I think that there's still on that table a lot of categories that can be collapsed. But I understand that, it's an iterative process. So.
Yeah, remapping is a challenging process. That's why we left them in place. But I completely agree from a philosophical and a practical standpoint. It affects all districts. I don't want to speak out of turn, Mr. Chairman, but I did have a question with respect to the direction on reconciling any kind of inconsistencies on I-1 and I-2 with PUDI. Again, we're more than happy to go down those columns and try to do that, but we would want to get direction from this body on that to take it forward as a recommendation to council if we were to do that.
Yeah, so I didn't know how to do that. Maybe Mr. Simpson, you can. So we have to make a motion. I think we'd have to make we'd have to have some things added, right, by consensus. Go ahead, Ms. Connell.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that part of the conversation in allowing uses was in the PUD process. We do have a public hearing process where we have neighborhood meetings and find ways to develop the standards appropriate for that particular use. In the I-1 zone district, it is a straight zoning, and we haven't developed standards for those additional uses that we might want to do before we add them to the table. So it was a conscious decision knowing that with the PUDI, we can do that. So I think the thought at the time was that it would make more sense on some of the other changes, also not just these, that we do that later when we can actually add additional standards.
How about where it's reversed, though? For example, salvage yards are allowed under I-2, but are as conditional use, but not under PUDI.
Right. Yeah, salvage yards is a very impactive industrial type use.
I understand, but why would you not have it as a conditional use under PUDI? Would you not evaluate it if somebody came to us?
There's kind of a narrow range of heavy industrial uses that really deserve being in a separate zone district, I-2, and we have very limited areas in the city that you can actually do that without impacting development.
So with respect also, if I might, our understanding of PUDI is that the original policy behind that was to attract primary employers, and salvage yards do have employees, and they may do fairly well, but per acre, not as many as maybe some of the light industrial uses. And so by putting them in with heavy industrial neighbors, concrete plants, and that kind of stuff, it's just kind of a good place for them. You may want to add them ultimately in a code rewrite to a PUDI. You may want to make all of your industrial districts PUDI in the end. We don't know that answer yet. We would certainly explore that as part of a long-term public process. And again, towards the goal of consistent and fair application where we sort of know where things ought to go. And anything that comes through can be allocated in the right direction.
Okay.
So if there were particular, it's kind of sticky because if you're saying that we could go through and add, allowed uses, it's almost more of a longer conversation, right? It's something you need to sit down and kind of pencil out. I don't know if we could do that in here right now. So the question then becomes, do we make a motion and move this on, or do we table this for that kind of discussion? Is there specific kinds of uses that somebody wants to have added to the table?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes?
Again, not wanting to speak out of order, so if it pleases the commission.
No, please.
We, again, going back to first principles, what we're proposing tonight is a 2 to 3 year fix. And by dealing with PUDI, we can deal with immediately pressing economic development issues. And so we think to the extent I think we have a strong agreement that we want to move towards consistency. It was not identified as a pressing priority. It's more at this point we think academic. So it might be a good idea to see what happens with the interim ordinance. And then if we need to tweak it along the way, that would be very easy because you've got your left side column all fixed and you've got your standards adjusted and your definitions in place. And if we need to do something before 3 years is up, then we can do that, or we can just roll it up into an overall code rewrite. But we think on the short run, if you've got industrial users that are knocking on your door, we can help them enter.
Yeah, I understand, and I probably agree with you, but I want to be sensitive if there's somebody who has strong feelings about adding particular uses now or moving forward with a motion. No?
Can I just echo
Yes.
Mr. Messenger's sentiments, I think, in a different way? I think while certainly we do want to give deference to the thoughts of the Planning Commission and individual commissioners, I think it's always wiser not to legislate on the fly. There is a process that's going to unfold, and this is the start of that process.
Right. So with that, is there a motion? No? Shall I enter this motion? Do you want to go ahead and enter this motion? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I move that LDC 2015-0001, Land Development Code Amendments to Section 5.2, Additional Use Standards and Conditions, Section 5.3, Accessory Uses and Structures, Section 10.3, Definition of Words, Terms, and Phrases, subsection 619.8, Height of Stored Items, and repealing and reenacting subsection 5.1.2, Summary Table of Allowed and Conditioned Principal Uses by Zoning District, be recommended to City Council for approval. The motion is based on the findings of fact and the approval criteria on page 7 of the staff report.
Is there any discussion of the motion? Seeing none? Oh, Mr. Rothschild.
I will be supporting the motion, and I commend everybody for their efforts in it. I do want to state that I think it's short-sighted is too harsh a word. I just think it's would be a better effort to make it internally consistent, which would not require significant effort before it's approved, because you're going to be living with it for whatever period of time, and the fixes in there, I think, are logical and easy to do.
Mr. Hannan.
I agree with Commissioner Rothschild. I think it would be a good idea to try and get our industrial somehow more congruent than I see it today. However, I do understand Ms. McConnell's discussion about the timing involved and quick fix versus midterm versus long term, and therefore I also will be approving.
If there's no Ms. Connell.
It's obvious that a lot of thought has gone into this process, and you've accepted the input of the public. So what we're saying is this is a start, and then we're building on this. Okay.
And if there's no other comments, commissioners, please cast your votes. And that motion passes 5-0. All commissioners present voting in favor. And so I guess that's, thank you. And you fully know how to follow the rest of the process, so I certainly don't need to give you any advice on that. All right, so moving on to other items. Yes.
We do not have any items scheduled for the September 8th meeting, so we would love it if you voted to cancel that meeting.
Can I get a motion to cancel, would you say the November 8th? No, not November 8th. September 8th meeting?
I move to
So moved?
So moved.
All right,
Cancel
Commissioners, cast
September
your,
8th.
cast your votes. And that miraculously passes 5-0, all commissioners voting in favor. All right, with that, we are adjourned.